Well, this is week 6 in our 7-week fall series. We're working with a book called Spiritual Economics by Eric Butterworth. And today we're going to be looking at chapter 9, which is called A New Look at Tithing. And what Eric has to say about tithing is probably not what we're used to hearing in Unity Centers. You know, in Unity we like to say that we have no creeds, we have no statements of faith, or any kind of rigid ideology that we require people to accept. About the closest thing to dogma, or perhaps I should call it a sacred cow, in Unity are our teachings about tithing that sometimes make the rounds in our Unity Centers. Now, there's an interesting thing about sacred cows. You know what they say about sacred cows? They make gourmet hamburger. Exactly. Yeah. So Eric Butterworth is taking the concept of tithing and he's transforming it into something new and into something maybe that we're not used to hearing. And to me it was a breath of fresh air when I read this chapter, because so much of what I was taught about tithing and so much of what I heard about tithing sounds like magical thinking. If I tithe, then my life will go well. And then they bring on the testimonials, right? You've heard them. Hey, when I started tithing, I got a check for $1,000 in the mail the very next week that I wasn't even expecting. Of course, who's to say that you wouldn't have gotten that anyway? All that kind of stuff happens. Or I got that new job that I always wanted and things like that. And the other part of the assumption is that if you don't tithe, your life isn't going to go well. In fact, I had a really funny graphic to show you up here that had death with death with the sickle coming down and saying tithe or die. Right? That's the message we get from some circles out there: tithe or die. And that sounds to me a little bit like using guilt and fear as tools to manipulate the way people think about that. And that's not what we're about. So when Eric talks about taking a new look at tithing, he wants to make sure that we're not engaging in magical thinking or anything that even hints at fear, guilt, or manipulation. So here's what Eric has to say on the subject. And even though we don't have quotes up here, as always, you have an insert in your bulletin that contains the pertinent quotes that we'll be working with today. So this is what Eric has to say in his new look at tithing. Let's hear less of tithing and more of giving. Let us not be deluded by the claims of the magical law of tithing. Tithing is not a law, but a technique for fulfilling the law of giving. There is no magic in it whatever, any more than there is magic in the flow of water when the tap is turned on. There is no need for magic when one works diligently to keep in the flow of life. Keeping in the flow of life, that's what it's all about. And we know this because in order to keep a river flowing, it needs two things. It has to have an inlet or input, and it has to have an outlet. Block the outlet, everything backs up, there's no flow. Cut off the inlet, everything dries up. Again, no flow. Another word for flow is circulation. And we all know what happens when people pull money out of circulation. We get a recession, right? A stepping back, a pulling back. Now, it's one thing if a person loses a job, can't make ends meet and things like that. But on the other hand, if people are hoarding money out of fear about the future, that just adds to the problem, actually creates the problem and then makes it worse. I'm going to paraphrase something here that the late, great Yogi Berra once said. We lost Yogi this year, but boy, he had a lot of wise and funny sayings. And this is something that he once said about baseball. He said, 90% of this game is half mental. I love Yogi. I mean, that's just beautiful. And it's true. It's true. You can have two athletes who are equals when it comes to the physical skills and training of playing a particular game. But the one who wins, all other things being equal, the one who wins is the one who has the mental game perfected. Consciousness, right? Consciousness is what it's all about. And tithing is consciousness conditioning. It's a consciousness condition. That's easy for me to say. Consciousness conditioning tool that helps us to keep circulation and the flow going. That's what it's all about. And this is a very different way of looking at tithing from what we find in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is where the word tithe comes from. Under the Hebrew Scriptures, the tithe was actually a form of taxation. It's found in the law contained in the book of Leviticus. And by the way, that's the same book that says people who work on the Sabbath should be put to death, among other things. So we need to proceed very carefully before we take anything from Leviticus literally. Really careful with that. Okay, the word tithe. You probably know it means 1/10. And this comes to us from an agrarian culture. So they didn't have a monetary system as we know it today. So this idea of the tithe was to take 1/10 of the crops and the herds that the people had, and then they would hand over this 1/10 to the priests, to the Levites at the temple as part of a legal obligation. There was nothing voluntary about it. It was required of them. Now, when it comes to tithing, and Bible quotes in support of tithing, the one that we hear over and over and over again, in Unity and in other circles, is the one that comes to us from Malachi. This is the one they like to use when they talk about tithing. Here it is. Bring the full tithe into the storehouse, so that there may be food in my house, and thus put me to the test, says the Lord of hosts. See if I will not open the windows of heaven for you, and pour down for you an overflowing blessing. That's the part that always gets quoted. What they always leave out are the two verses that come before that. We'll get to that in a moment. Malachi was dealing with a problem here. The problem he was dealing with were the people trying to find loopholes in this, what was essentially a taxation system. They were looking for loopholes. Tithing was a form of taxation. And what does everyone do when tax time comes around? We try to find legal loopholes. We hire a CPA to find all the loopholes, deductions, deferments, whatever it is that we can legally get. And that's the problem with reducing giving and generosity to a legality. We invite that kind of attitude. So, in the days of Malachi, the people were giving 1/10 all right, but it was the 1/10 they didn't want. It was the bad cattle, the inferior cattle, the stunted grain. They figured, hey, as long as it's 1/10, who cares, right? What difference did it make? Well, for Malachi, it made a big difference. Okay, here's the part of the quote I was talking about that everyone, and I mean everyone who talks about tithing, leaves out. This is the part that comes first. See if you can tell why people leave it out. Here it is. Will anyone rob God? Yet you are robbing me. But you say, how are we robbing you? In your tithes and offerings. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, the whole nation of you. That's the part that gets left out. Pretty easy to see why, right? God, acting through Malachi, starts out by cursing the people. But then turns around in that second part that everyone likes to use and offers that overflowing blessing. Now, those of us who like police and crime dramas, we know exactly what's going on here, don't we? Malachi is playing good cop, bad cop. He's playing good cop, bad cop with the Hebrew people. You know how that works. You watch these crime dramas, the suspect gets dragged into the interrogation room, and the first cop comes in, and he may have a rubber hose or something, and tells the guy how bad it's going to be if he doesn't talk and cooperate. And then the partner comes in and says, hey, that guy's a hothead. He gets a little bit carried away. I can keep him from messing you up, but you got to cooperate with me, and then maybe I'll be able to stop him. That's the whole game here. That's what's going on here. Malachi says God is going to well and truly curse the living heck out of you unless you stop trying to find loopholes. I might be able to persuade him to bless you instead of curse you. Yeah, that's the ticket. He'll pour out a blessing. This is wrong on so many levels I hardly know where to begin. First of all, God isn't some entity that we bargain with like a mafia boss. God doesn't curse. God doesn't bless. The blessing comes when we learn how to practice gratitude and generosity. Then we bring that consciousness out into the world, and when that happens, we become the blessing. It's all that consciousness conditioning again. Okay, so that's what we find in the Hebrew Scriptures. What about tithing in the Gospels? Not much. Really, about the only thing we hear is Jesus talking about, actually he's criticizing the Pharisees because they're giving 1/10 of their herds and crops to the temple, but then they go ahead and just ignore the plight of the poor and the homeless the rest of the time. Jesus wasn't critical of tithing per se. He was just critical, once again, of the legalistic interpretation and the state of consciousness that it engenders. So, the message, I think, is pretty clear. First of all, let's stop quoting the Bible in support of tithing. And second, and this is what Eric was getting at, tithing is not a law or an end unto itself. It's a practice that can be used to cultivate a spirit of generosity. And one of the biggest barriers to developing a spirit of generosity is a state of consciousness that we all know. It's that state of consciousness that says, not enough. Not enough. When we look at the world through the lens of not enough, we're cultivating fear and anxiety instead of generosity. We're blocking the flow. And the only reason that we have this state of mind called not enough is because of our conditioning. Call it our negative conditioning. And what we need is a different kind of conditioning to counteract it. That's what Eric means when he says that there is no need for magic when one works diligently to keep in the flow of life. Emphasis on the word work. Or perhaps a better term might be practice. Practice. Tithing is a consciousness conditioning tool. Positive conditioning that builds up our spiritual muscles to counteract the message of not enough. It keeps the flow going. That's the reason that tithing is still around, despite the fact that some churches and teachers misinterpret it or misuse it, turn it into dogma, magic, guilt, fear. There's really a practical aspect about tithing that's still valuable. When I teach a prosperity class, I tell the students that the tithe, 10%, serves two very practical purposes. And in Unity, we are all about practical. First, it's easy to use. Anyone can calculate 10% of any amount in their head without using a calculator or even having to count on your fingers, right? 10% is easy. You don't need a formula. And second, 10% as a rule of thumb is an amount that is significant without being painful. And if it seems like too much, if it's painful, if the fear comes up, if we can't pay the bills, that might be a sign that it's too much for right now. The important thing in whatever we do, any kind of conditioning, the most important thing is to be disciplined and consistent. That's what conditioning is all about. We've got a class that's been meeting now for the past 6 weeks, learning how to meditate. And one of the things that we stress in teaching meditation is that you don't start by sitting for an hour, by committing. I'm going to sit for, I've never done this before, but I'm going to sit in meditation for 1 hour every single day. That's kind of setting ourselves up for a failure. It's far, far better to commit to do 10 minutes every single day instead of an hour one day and then giving up on it the rest of the day of the week. Conditioning, consistency, and discipline are the keys. One final point here. Some of the more, shall we say, dogmatic approaches to tithing that you'll hear out there say that you must, and that's in capital letters, you must take out the tithe before you pay any other bills. Doesn't matter if there's not enough left for the other bills, you must take it out because that means you're putting God first. Why would we want to turn God into a jealous, needy bean counter? I've never understood it. I've never understood it. Since when is the voluntary obligation represented by a mortgage or a utility bill somehow less sacred than anything else? It's never made sense to me. I question it because that kind of thinking takes us back into this dualistic view of the universe where we separate spiritual from material and then conclude that the material aspect of our existence is somehow secondary or inferior. The name of this movement is unity, not duality. We are spiritual and physical beings, spiritual and physical beings having an experience of reality. And we need to honor all aspects of our existence instead of separating them out and saying, this is less than, and this is somehow better or more real. Generosity is the goal because it sustains both our physical and our spiritual needs, and it doesn't carry with it this dangerous idea that we give in order to create wealth or other benefits for ourselves. And that's when we cultivate that spirit of generosity, and that's when we become the blessing that's poured out on the world. We're going to wrap it all up next week. Hope to see you then. Thank you.